Have you ever imagined watching a man so powerful, so untouchable, that everyone around him bowed in fear, only to see him lose everything because of one single lawsuit? That's exactly what happened to him. To the world, Richard Hale was the face of success. Billionaire, philanthropist, the man who built an empire from nothing. He smiled on magazine covers, spoke about ethics and leadership on TV, and donated millions to charity. People worshipped him. His name was synonymous with victory. But what the world didn't see was the rot beneath the marble floors of his empire. I saw it. I lived it. I worked under him once, long enough to know that every deal he made came with a lie, and every smile hid a threat. He bought silence, crushed competitors, and buried anyone who dared to question him. People called it business. I called it destruction. I remember the day he ruined me. One false accusation, one forged document, and overnight, I became the villain in a story he had written. My reputation, gone. My career, over. And while I lost everything, he just smiled, shook hands with the press, and moved on. But he made one mistake. He underestimated how much I was willing to fight back. I spent months in silence, pretending to disappear. But behind the scenes, I was gathering evidence. Quietly, piece by piece, the fake contracts, the hidden accounts, the people he'd paid off. And when the time came, I filed the lawsuit that would expose him for who he really was. When the verdict was read, I watched his world collapse. The board resigned, investors fled, and the man who once ruled everything sat frozen, unable to speak. And here's the thing. The truth I uncovered didn't just end his empire. It revealed something far darker than anyone expected. Because what destroyed him wasn't just greed. It was the secret he'd been hiding for years. One that would shock even his most loyal followers. Stay with me until the end. Because what I'm about to tell you next will leave you absolutely stunned. For years, I believed in hard work and loyalty. I built my career from the ground up. Every late night, every sacrifice, every deal I closed. All under one name. Hale Industries. To work for Richard Hale was a dream. People said he turned ordinary men into millionaires, that his company was a family. At first, I believed that lie too. Richard had a charisma that could blind anyone. He was the kind of man who'd shake your hand and make you feel like you mattered, until the day you didn't. The moment you stopped serving his purpose, you became expendable. I was his project manager, trusted to oversee contracts worth millions. But one deal, the biggest one of my career, went wrong. Overnight, everything changed. Documents I'd never seen appeared under my name. Signatures that weren't mine were verified. And suddenly, I was accused of fraud. The same fraud Richard had orchestrated. He didn't just fire me. He destroyed me. My accounts were frozen. My name was printed across headlines. Hale executive caught in scandal. The man I'd served for 7 years stood before cameras, shaking his head in disappointment. We had no idea, he said. We trusted him. That one sentence crushed me more than any lawsuit could, because it wasn't just a lie, it was a masterpiece of manipulation. I lost everything in weeks. My job, my home, my reputation. People stopped calling. Friends avoided me. Even my parents asked if the rumors were true. And Hale, he thrived. Stock prices rose, investors cheered. The press called him a leader who cleans his own house. That's when I realized he wasn't untouchable because he was good. He was untouchable because he was careful. His lawyers were sharks, the kind who could twist the law until it snapped. Reporters adored him because he made them rich with stories. Every part of the system bent in his favor. But even the strongest walls crack when you press the right spot. The first crack came during a press conference, when one journalist asked about the missing charity funds Hale had promised the year before. He smiled, but his eyes flickered. For just a second, I saw it. Fear. That moment stuck with me. If there was fear, there was weakness. So, I started watching. Quietly. Patiently. I followed his public appearances, read his filings, traced every name connected to his deals. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew how to think like one now, because I'd been burned by the best. Then, something strange happened. A former employee, one I'd helped years ago, reached out to me anonymously. "You were right," she said. He's hiding something big. But if you want to expose him, you'll need proof and courage. Her message reignited something inside me. I'd spent months drowning in bitterness, telling myself there was no justice in this world. But maybe there was, if I was willing to fight for it the right way. I stopped drinking, stopped feeling sorry for myself, and started digging. Public records, old contracts, archived news articles, every trail that led back to Hale. And with every page I turned, every document I found, I saw the same pattern, the same lies repeated over and over, protected by money and influence. That's when I made my decision. If Hale had built his empire on deception, then I would use his own weapon against him. The law. Not gossip, not revenge in the shadows. A lawsuit. One so detailed, so airtight, that not even his army of lawyers could stop it. But what I didn't know then was that behind all the corruption, there was something even darker waiting to surface. Something that would shock the entire courtroom. I started with something small. The kind of detail most people would shrug off. When you're investigating a man like Richard Hale, the first victories feel almost trivial. A single line item, a single number that refuses to add up. I found that line buried in an old contract archived on a public database, an acquisition deal filed 2 years earlier. On paper, the deal looked flawless, until I compared the ledger entries. The revenue projection attached to the contract didn't match the audited statements. A six-figure margin was missing. An invoice number referenced in the contract didn't exist in the company's financial system. It was the kind of clerical error his accountants would usually sweep under the rug, except it wasn't clerical. The numbers had been altered. Once I had that mismatch in my hands, I felt the first real surge of hope. I printed copies, annotated them, and felt the cold thrill that comes from finding a tiny crack in a supposedly flawless facade. I didn't confront him then. I knew better than to rush. I tucked the papers away and kept watching. The next piece came from a direction I'd never expected, an email leak. Sometime during a routine sweep of archived web caches and cached PDF disclosures, I stumbled on an internal memo, a draft email between two senior executives at Hale Industries. At first it looked like corporate boilerplate, but one paragraph made my skin crawl. It outlined a deliberate plan to adjust reporting timelines to influence quarterly results, and it used language that read less like strategy and more like instruction. Push revenue into Q3, defer liabilities, and ensure the audit covers the gap. The sender signed off with a nickname only insiders used for Richard himself. There it was in black and white. Manipulation, not mistake. I forwarded the memo to a secure drive, and my hands shook as I imagined the defense his lawyers would try to build. I also realized how careful Richard was. For him to be implicated in a document like that meant either extreme arrogance or a belief in absolute immunity. Either way, the leak gave me leverage and fear. If this got traced, it could vanish. So I duplicated everything, sent encrypted copies to a lawyer I was cultivating, and slept for the first time in weeks without replaying the worst-case scenarios in my head. Then the human element surfaced, a witness who changed everything. An old colleague reached out through an anonymous burner email. If you want the truth, meet at the diner on 8th at dawn. I almost ignored it, thinking it a trap or a prank, but I went. She was smaller than I remembered, her hair more gray, but her eyes were steady. She used to run a small audit team before she left Hale under amicable circumstances. What she told me wasn't flashy. It was methodical and devastating. She described phantom vendors, shell companies registered in offshore jurisdictions, and payoffs funneled through consultants. More importantly, she handed me internal travel logs, showing trips that didn't match billing records and notes indicating Richard personally approved special vendor retainers with no deliverable listed. Hearing her account in person made the whole thing real in a way documents never could. Her voice didn't waver as she handed over scanned receipts and told me, I kept copies. I thought I was protecting myself. I didn't think anyone would ever care. That night, I drove home with a box of scanned files and a feeling that the mountain I was climbing had acquired real footholds. The fourth discovery was the kind that stops your breath. Bank transactions. I hired a forensic accountant through the lawyer, and we traced payments through a thicket of corporate entities. What we uncovered was a pattern of transfers that, when followed, led to a quiet account in a bank I'd never heard of. controlled by an entity listed under a trustee's name in another country. The amounts were structured just below reporting thresholds and wired through multiple intermediaries. Classic layering. It wasn't just clever bookkeeping, it was a pipeline. Money came in from contracts that should have reported to shareholders and flowed out to accounts tied to properties Richard's company didn't own. When we connected those dots, invoices to shell companies to foreign accounts to properties purchased under nominee names, the narrative shifted from shady to criminal. I remember staring at the spreadsheet at 3 a.m, the columns of numbers glowing on my screen, and feeling both terrified and vindicated. If we could show the court this money trail, it would be more than a scandal. It would be proof of deliberate concealment and fraud. Just when I thought I had enough to dismantle his defenses, the final and most damning piece fell into my lap almost by accident. Richard had made a rare appearance at a charity gala, and in his haste, arrogance perhaps, he left his phone in a valet car that had been mistakenly parked behind the service entrance. A low-level attendant found it and, either out of conscience or chance, brought it to the diner where my anonymous witness worked. She recognized the name, called me, and asked what I wanted to do with it. In a frantic, precisely choreographed retrieval, we secured the device, wiped nothing, and handed it to the lawyer. What we found changed the entire game. Dozens of voice notes, calendar entries marked with initials and hotel names, photos of signed blank-page forms with client names written in shorthand, and, most explosive of all, a USB drive image tucked into a folder labeled Operation Ledger. On that drive was a digital notebook, a mess of entries referencing payoffs, lists of soft targets, and scanned signed documents with Richard's initials scrawled in the margins. It was the whole architecture of his deceit, mapped out by his own hand and stored carelessly like someone who believed themselves invincible. Each discovery built on the last, a staircase that gradually became a stairway to the truth. My hands grew steadier with each piece of evidence, and my plan crystallized. Contracts to show pattern, emails to prove intent, witnesses to attest to practice, bank trails to demonstrate the mechanics, and the USB to seal the narrative with his fingerprints all over it. I could already picture how it would look in a courtroom. A web of documents and testimony that would force even the most zealous defense to explain away the pattern. But I also knew the risks. Richard's legal team would come roaring back. Journalists might be bribed to bury stories, and I could be intimidated in ways I'd only read about. Still, for the first time since he'd ruined me, I felt genuine resolve. I filed everything with my lawyer, locked the encrypted copies in multiple safe locations, and prepared for the battle that would move from backroom sleuthing to the center stage of public scrutiny. What I hadn't expected was how personal the fallout would be, and how one secret, once revealed, would explode everything in ways neither of us could predict. The courthouse smelled of coffee and old paper. Cameras lined the hallway like a jury of light. Reporters clustered under the high ceilings, their whispers a constant tide. Word had spread, Hale versus me. The case that everyone said would never get off the ground was suddenly the story of the year. His PR team called it a baseless vendetta. My lawyer called it the moment of truth. I called it the moment I'd been preparing for, the ascent to the summit. The gallery filled with people who once admired him, shareholders in navy suits, local politicos with tidy smiles, and then, further back, members of the families he'd crushed, quiet faces that held grudges and hopes in equal measure. Richard's wife sat with a composed face, his children flitted their eyes and swallowed. His legal team looked like a small army. The lead attorney adjusted his cufflinks with a steady, practiced calm. The judge entered and the room silenced into a dense, expectant hush. We opened with facts. The dry bones any juror needs to understand the anatomy of a crime, contracts, ledgers, and chain of custody statements. But I could feel the energy shift as we moved from paper to people. My lawyer laid out the first piece of the puzzle, the altered acquisition contract. The prosecutor walked the gallery through the numbers, the mismatch, the missing invoice. You could see the jurors lean forward, eyes reading the pages, watching the curtain pull back a fraction. Then the internal memo was brought up. My lawyer narrated the context while the clerk projected the email onto the screen. The line about pushing revenue into Q3 flashed in full. I heard a gasp from the back row. That sounded like an intake of air the room couldn't hold. Richard's lead attorney objected, claiming hearsay, trying to paint it as an isolated draft. But the email was dated, traced to an internal server, and the forensic analyst testified to its authenticity. Evidence was stacking, not as isolated crumbs, but as an architected design. The witness I'd met at the diner took the stand next. She went slowly, deliberately. Her voice was steady as she walked the jury through inconsistencies she'd found while auditing accounts years before. She showed travel logs, flagged consultants who billed for services that never occurred, and explained the pattern of shell vendors. The prosecutor asked the right questions. Her testimony transformed the document pile into a pattern, a system. People nodded. Reporters scribbled furiously. One cameraman zoomed in on Richard's face, a small, controlled grimace. We saved the bank trail for the mid-case blow. Our forensic accountant unfurled the money map like a geological survey chart. Invoices, transfers, intermediary accounts, offshore repositories, and finally properties registered under nominee names. The numbers marched across the screen in columns and arrows. The judge paused, looking at the display as if at a crime scene. The lead defense attorney tried to denounce the links as circumstantial, a creative accounting interpretation. But when the accountant showed how the transfers bypassed compliance thresholds and used the same shell companies repeatedly, the defense's posture began to crack. And then came the moment I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times. The phone and the USB. The courtroom held its breath as my lawyer explained the chain of custody, how the device was found, secured, and forensically imaged. The projection flickered, and we played an audio clip, a voice note of Richard speaking plainly about retainers and soft targets. The jurors shifted in their seats. Reporters leaned forward. My palms were sweating, but my voice inside was perfectly still. One by one, we unveiled the contents of Operation Ledger. Dated entries, names, shorthand notes about payoffs, scanned signatures that matched the forged forms, and meticulous lists of deliverables that never existed. Each file played like a chapter in his manual for deception. The courtroom temperature seemed to tilt. Even the judge's eyebrows rose. Richard's lead counsel filed motion after motion, trying to discredit the retrieval, painting the chain of custody as compromised. He launched into a fierce theatrical assault. Insinuations, alternative theories, appeals to the jury's skepticism. For a moment, it looked like the defense might rally, a last-ditch fortress of doubt. But then the forensic analyst, called back under cross-examination, walked the panel through the metadata, timestamps, hash values, deletion logs. The machine had recorded everything. The defense's castles of conjecture began to crumble. At the peak of the session, the prosecution displayed a single entry from the ledger, a handwritten initial scrawled beside a line item labeled Special Disbursement, 0712. The court reporter paused. The judge leaned forward. Richard's face went still. For the first time all trial, he was wordless. His lawyers whispered frantically. The gallery murmured like a storm rolling in. When the court recess was called that day, people spilled into the hallways in clusters, exchanging stunned theories. The national networks treated the trial as front-page theater. And as I stood in the corridor, watching Richard guided past the bank of cameras, I felt the ascent complete. Not because I'd won, but because the summit was in view. Public exposure, undeniable evidence, and a narrative the press could not ignore. But the highest peak still waited. The last revelation that would not only topple his company, but reveal something stranger and darker that few could have imagined. The mountain wasn't over. The final climb would be the most terrifying step of all. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air like thunder after a long storm. Richard Hale didn't move at first. His hands trembled slightly on the defense table, his eyes fixed on nothing. The empire he'd built on lies and intimidation was gone. Stripped by the same law he thought he could bend forever. Reporters flooded the steps outside, shouting questions that no one answered. Inside, the judge's gavel struck one final time, and the sound echoed like a closing chapter. Hale's lawyers whispered to him, but he didn't respond. When the officers approached to escort him out, he stood, not as a titan, but as a hollow man, a monument collapsing under its own weight. A few seats behind me, families who'd lost everything because of him wept openly. Some hugged, some simply stared ahead, stunned that justice had finally arrived. As for me, I couldn't even smile. My chest felt both heavy and free, the strange mix of triumph and exhaustion that comes when a battle ends, not with fireworks, but with quiet truth. The revenge was complete. The law had done what I could not. Legal revenge doesn't erase the pain, but it ends the cruelty and proves that justice still exists. It took years, sleepless nights, and the courage to face a man who thought he was untouchable. But in the end, truth outlasted power. Justice may move slowly, but it never stops moving. So here's my question to you. If you were in my place, would you have the courage to fight a man like Richard Hale through the law, knowing what it might cost? Share your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you believe in justice, and don't forget to subscribe for more true revenge stories.